Coach Freeman said it today, right? This is why you come to Notre Dame. It's for games like this.
Yo, it's one of the things we pointed out in talking about the Syracuse game. Like, would Syracuse be ready for the moment? Because Notre Dame has a moment every week. Either they're in a big game or they are someone's big game every time they step on the field. And when you come to Notre Dame, that becomes the norm. It's no different than Clemson coming to town. Like Marcus Freeman said, this is what we do. This is why you come here. And that is the message to the recruits that'll show up. Like, this is what it is. Like, you're here for one day, but it's a big game every week at Notre Dame. We are Notre Dame. And it's going to be a challenge, but it becomes probably a different type of challenge than I think even the players expected. And what I mean by that is that I believe the players probably expected to be 7-1, 8-0 going into this matchup, if you ask them honestly, in the summertime. But unfortunately, that's not the record. But the importance of the game and the gravity of the game for the success of the season, even though there have been some slip-ups, still remains. And without question, you win this game and you start building towards November, and that big matchup at the end of November becomes even bigger. And now you're talking about, after having disappointing losses, a sweep in November going into a big-time bowl game, you feel pretty good about a first-year head coach that has gained a lot of experience. Brian, you know what? There's a phrase, that we are familiar with from a biblical standpoint, like, you need go through Samaria, right? There are certain paths that you have to take. But a long term, I think everyone would want this team to be undefeated.
Sure.
Have an outside chance for the college football playoff. But what we've seen gained in experience and toughness from the head coach and the foundation of things being established for the program moving forward, Notre Dame might have had to go through something like this season. No, we don't like the fact that it is at 5-3 right now. Maybe they could have gone through some of these things at 6-2 without the loss to Stanford, or 7-1. But either way, I think the way things are as it sits today goes into what you just talked about. There's an opportunity here that is right before this team, this coaching staff, and this program, and they should take full advantage of it because it's right there for the taking. It's not something that's out of their reach.
Sure.
It's right there.
Right.
It's right there. Yeah, Clemson's a good team, but as Marcus Freeman said, we're a good team too.
Right. Sean, when you talk about this game and you talk about what Coach Freeman has been through this season and what he's learned, look, there were mistakes that were made, right? Notre Dame, no matter what happens between now and the end of the season, Notre Dame will not be the team they should have been, big picture. But as you stated so well, there are times you can say, look, this isn't how we wanted it to go, but it's how it went. And here's what we learned from it. We didn't expect it to happen this way. We didn't want it to happen this way. I'll never be someone that says, looking back, I'm glad they lost 3 games. No, I'm not going to say that. What I'm going to say is, boy, I'm glad they learned the right lessons from those 3 games. And not every coach does. Not every coach goes through those type of experiences and says, hey, this is the correct lessons to learn. As we talked in the Syracuse postgame show, you started to see the fingerprints of Marcus Freeman more on the entire nature of the football team. And now all of a sudden the offense and defense started looking a little bit more like what the special teams has looked like all season. And we'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where, you don't want to go through it. You don't want it to be that way. But if you learn the right lessons from it, it can make you stronger than you otherwise would have, right? You don't really know how you're going to respond to being tested with fire until you're tested with fire, right? You don't know how you're going to handle that adversity until you actually have to experience adversity. And he talked about that a little bit today. And we're not going to play that part of the press conference because we're only allowed to show 3 minutes of a press conference per rules. But he talked about, yes, winning is like, somebody asked him about learning from the game. And he talked about, you want to learn from the game. But then he went right into basically talking about but we got to make sure we don't lose sight of the lessons we learned from the failures. And I thought that was really savvy. Like, yeah, I mean, you can't just say, oh, we've won, we've arrived.
Yeah.
Say, hey, you get a little too big for your britches. Hey, I got Stanford tape from like 2 weeks ago that I can pop in for you real quick if you know, if you think you've arrived. You know what I mean? And you don't think you got to put in the work today or whatever the case may be. So I think those are important things to look at and say, winning the rest of the way doesn't absolve the team of the losses to Marshall and to Stanford or the struggles to beat some other teams. But what it does is that, okay, you're now back on track. The path was this to a championship. This was the path you were on, right? And you took a little detour. You got a little bit lost, but you found your way back on, and you're back on track. May not be this year, but it can be for next year. And I do think that how you finish the season is important, Sean.
Absolutely.
We've seen this a lot. I mean, we've talked a lot about USC in 2016, and by the end of the year, nobody wanted to play USC in 2016. Well, Notre Dame has a chance to kind of be that team. They're not that team right now. They're not that team because of what they did to Stanford. They're not. I mean, they should have beat Stanford. I mean, let's be real about this. The win over Stanford was great. Love it. You went on the road, you beat a ranked team. But if Notre Dame was the team they were supposed to be, they would have been ranked higher than Stanford and would have been favored against Stanford. I mean, they would have been, right? If they'd have beat Marshall and Stanford, Syracuse. When they went in to play Syracuse last weekend, Notre Dame would have been ranked higher. They'd have been a top 10 team, only would have lost to Ohio State, and they'd have been favored to win. Right? So you aren't that team yet. This is the opportunity to say, okay, yes, we're back on track. We're back on track. And we're becoming that team. And if you don't win, it's at the point now where I know this is year 1 of Coach Freeman's tenure, but this is year 13 of a rebuilding experience that's been going on for a while. And part of the frustration with the previous coach was I'm sick of almost winning those games.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's time to win those games. And that's the other part of this, Sean, is the opportunity to go out and beat a team like Clemson with no excuses. Right? No, well, they didn't have their starting quarterback, and they didn't have this guy, and then have that guy, and then a month later they beat you in the ACC title game. You have a chance now to beat them, and there's nothing they can do about it until next year, when you've got to go to their place. So it's a tremendous opportunity from that regard. It's a great confidence builder because I feel like, I don't want to say, like you and I were talking yesterday and about this, I don't want to say that there's no way Navy and Boston College can beat Notre Dame because Marshall and Stanford beat Notre Dame, right?
Right.
But what I meant was, what I'm saying about what I feel about it is, if you beat Clemson and Syracuse back to back, then that team that lost to Marshall and Stanford, that team that lacked confidence, that team that lacked the emotion, that team that lacked the fire, the direction, the discipline, the leadership, and all those things that cause you to lose those games, that team dies, because that team has to die in order to be the team that can beat Syracuse and Stanford and Clemson in back-to-back games. And that's my point. And I think that team will be gone, and then we'll see what Notre Dame is the rest of the way. And that's kind of what this opportunity presents as well. And then finally, of course, Sean, the perception that is there for Marcus Freeman, that is there for this Notre Dame program. If you beat Clemson in a game where it's not a fluky game or something like that, where you just go out like, you know what, Notre Dame was better that day, then that's that final thing to say, okay, Marcus Freeman has officially arrived as a head coach. He went through the ups and downs at Notre Dame, but he stepped up after Stanford. He made the changes. He did what was needed to be done. And now this team is finally where it should have been. It took a little longer than it should have, but the point is they're there.
I don't know about you, but I would take some flukiness. I'm cool with that.
No, I'll take a win no matter what.
That bounces off of 2 Clemson guys into the hand of a Notre Dame receiver.
I will take a win no matter what. My comment is more of the perception of Notre Dame.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
Would be different. But yeah, for me personally, I'm taking a win however I can get it.
There's no doubt about it. That this is, because if we're honest, as much as they would say no if you asked them publicly, I think they put a lot of energy into that Ohio State game.
Sure.
And I think the Ohio State loss was a letdown of sorts. And I'm not going to say they weren't prepared, because they had a fourth quarter lead against Marshall.
Right.
Did they play well? No. But at some point, you can forget what got you here, right?
Yeah.
And you can think that it just is going to happen, right? I don't think anybody, I think we all were watching that Marshall game saying, okay, they're about to take over. Okay, they're about to take over. Okay, they had the ball in Marshall territory up 3. They're about to go down and score and take over.
Sure.
And they didn't do what was necessary to finish the task. And that was a tough lesson. That's a tough lesson. I think a lot of the leaders, Jared Patterson took it hard. Isaiah Foskey took it hard. And a lot of those leaders, along with the players on the roster, they had to look themselves in the mirror. They had to look themselves.
I think it took them a while to figure themselves out, Sean.
Yes. You're right. You're absolutely right. And also, I think we're starting to see big picture. I think we're starting to see some buy-in to some of the things they're being asked to do. And Clemson is going to go a long way to kind of verifying.
Correct.
That.
Or showing, hey, you just out-talented Syracuse. That's all you did.
Yeah.
Right? Syracuse's quarterback, because if you lose to Clemson, it's, well, Syracuse's quarterback was beat up. He didn't play the second half. You got that pick 6 early, and that kind of threw them off. And it was just a good day for you and a bad day for them. But you're still 5-4. And you still lost to Marshall, and you still lost to Stanford. And you don't have a win that negates those losses. And that's the thing. That's the difference between Clemson and Stanford, or Syracuse. I don't know why I keep saying Stanford. But you look at Clemson, you look at Syracuse, and this is two teams that played each other tough a couple weeks ago. They're very similar in style.
Yep.
They're built differently. Clemson's bigger and, different type of personnel, but they're really good defensive teams that want to run the football and not turn it over on offense. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between Clemson and Syracuse, which is why that game between those two teams was so close and hard fought, is they're very similar teams. But perception-wise, is Clemson is here and Syracuse is here and Notre Dame is here and Notre Dame is trying to get to here.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this is, because this is still one of the elite teams in college football. Are they what they were with Deshaun and Trevor? No, they're not. But they're still one of the elite teams. They're still a team that's 18-3 the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And has won, how many games in a row? Right? Because they started off like 2-3 last year. Clemson's won. Look at their 21 schedule. They won their last 6 games in a row. And then they've obviously started the season off 8 in a row. So we're winning 14 games in a row. They're not the team they were. They're still pretty good. And, we're going to spend all week diving into the matchup and all that kind of stuff, but it's still Clemson. And they're still undefeated. They're still the number 5 team in the country. I'm actually a little surprised they're as low as they are. They got Louisville. After this, they got Louisville at home, Miami at home, and South Carolina at home. That's probably a 3-0 finish to the season.
Absolutely.
So you finish this year with beating the ACC. Here's another thing too, Sean. If things go the way that they're going right now, there's an opportunity for Notre Dame to say, we beat the ACC Atlantic champ at home. We beat the ACC Coastal champ on the road.
Yeah.
Now, Clemson right now is 6-0 in conference. Syracuse is 3-1. The next 2 best records in the league are Florida State and Louisville at 3-3 apiece. The only team with a shot to knock Clemson off of the Atlantic Division title is Syracuse, but they would need Clemson to lose twice at home to Miami and who did I just say? It was Miami and Louisville. They would literally need it. Clemson only has to win one of their next 2 games after Notre Dame, because the Notre Dame game doesn't matter. Yeah. 2 of Clemson's final 4 games are non-conference games. If Clemson beats one of Miami or Louisville, they clinch the Coastal, because if they tie with Syracuse, they win the head-to-head.
Yeah.
And then you look at the Coastal Division. North Carolina is currently 4-0 in that division. The next best teams, it's Duke and Miami are tied at 2-2. Now, North Carolina has already beaten Miami. They've already beaten Duke. So, again, those teams would need North Carolina to lose 3 times, and they play at Virginia, at Wake Forest, home against Georgia Tech, home against NC State. They would literally need North Carolina to lose 3 times, because North Carolina would likely have the head-to-head again. And now that's, of course, unless Miami and Duke both run the table, then there's a three-way tie. But the odds of that happening right now, based on the schedules, are not high. No. So there's a good chance that North Carolina and Clemson are going to be the ACC representatives for the ACC title, and Notre Dame can say we beat both of them.
Honestly, that's for me at this point. That would be a pick'em game for me in that ACC championship game.
Oh yes, that'd be a pick'em for me. That Carolina receiving core against this Clemson
that secondary.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Very interesting matchup, and like you said, the resume. Look, Notre Dame has no one to blame but themselves. This resume should have been very impressive at 7-1 going into this week. Very impressive, right? Yep. Ohio State, North Carolina win, Syracuse win. At least 2 big wins. 7-1, you lost to Ohio State, okay. If you come away with the victory against Ohio State, you're undefeated. But like you said, that's water under the bridge right now.
Right.
You got bigger fish to fry.
Yeah.
And that's closing out this season and building.
Yeah.
Continue to add to the foundation, right? The foundation is by percentage is the most expensive thing in building a home, right? Especially if you want a really good one. I think it's somewhere like 8 to 10% of the home's total cost. But it's the most important, right? Because if you mess up the foundation, you pretty much have to tear everything down. If it's a bad foundation. You have a great foundation and you have some imperfections, some windows here or a wall here. Okay, we can deal with that. And in laying the foundation, like we said, if they had to go through this to lay a good foundation for the program moving forward, then okay. Like, we don't like it. Right. We wish we didn't have to experience the tough losses. But you know what? Brighter days are ahead.
Sure.
And one of those brighter days could end up being Saturday night around 11 o'clock.
And that's the opportunity here, Sean, right? Yeah. Notre Dame will be defined more by what it does from here to the end of November.
Absolutely.
Than what it was in September to October. Now, those will always be part of the conversation, because then there'll be the question of what could have been. But I would much rather deal with the what could have been conversations because you beat Clemson and USC than the 7-5 football season and it's a disappointing year, because we're looking at potentially 9-3 or 7-5. I mean, that's really like a realistic look at it. Those are very different things. 8-4 versus 9-3, very different in my opinion, right? But the perception of this football team at 9-3 would be so much greater with wins over Clemson and USC than if this team went 9-3 but lost to Ohio State, beat Marshall, beat Stanford, lost to Clemson, lost to USC. Because then you're just a Brian Kelly coach team again, right? Because that's what Kelly's record would have been against this kind of schedule. That's what it always had been in the past. You lose to the teams that are ranked high. You don't beat those teams, right? And so that you look at it and say, okay, I mean, what was the stat that you said? If they beat Clemson this Saturday, they'll have more top 25 wins than what Brian Kelly had the last 2 years combined.
Yeah.
Right? That's what the opportunity is. And now your perception has changed. And the point is, doesn't excuse the losses. I want people to understand that. This is not what we're trying to do here. We don't do that here. It doesn't excuse the losses. But what it says is we have learned from those losses and we've come out stronger. And that's how you finish the season. And so I think those are the things that's the opportunity that's in front of Notre Dame today. And I want to play Coach Freeman's comments from today, Sean, and just so you can kind of hear him talking about in two different sections of the show of him talking about just here's the opportunities that's in front of the team when it comes to playing Clemson. And we're going to we'll talk about what he says, but there's some very interesting things that he said. So I'm going to just play that here now.
That's what you get when you get a team like Notre Dame and Clemson. It's a heavyweight battle, and two great historic programs that get to go and clash it out. That it's probably going to be one of those games that come down to the last couple series and who executes the most. But I remember Ian Book throwing that long pass, I think to Avery Davis. right? There's a couple plays just stick out in my mind. I know that at the end of the game that they got after the quarterback a little bit, didn't give him a chance to really throw the ball in that second overtime. And I'm just thinking back, like there's plays as I'm sitting here talking to you, like just like, oh man, I remember that play, And I think did Dorr have a big hit? I think I remember him knocking somebody. Bramley, not Dorr, Bramley, yeah. Yeah, like he rocked somebody. I'm like, man, they got a punter that's he's physical, man. So there's as we're talking, like there's just plays that come to my mind, but I know at the end of the game, Notre Dame was victorious. I know we got a battle coming ahead, a tall task coming ahead of us, but listen, man, I want our guys to understand you're Notre Dame, right? And that, you know what, this is what we do. We play in big games like this. It's not a David versus Goliath. This is a heavyweight fight. And we got a dang good football team that I've always said it, man. When we do exactly what we're supposed to do, we're a good enough football team to win every game we play. But you know what? We have to do that because we've seen if we don't execute, we don't do our job, we're not going to be victorious. And you've seen that in some of the games we played this year. So this isn't as I said, this isn't a David versus Goliath. This is Notre Dame versus Clemson, two blue blood programs that are going to go battle Saturday night here in Notre Dame Stadium.
Sean, I thought his comments were important because now it's one thing for him to say it. Okay, that's fine. It's good. The importance is if that's the attitude that he then puts onto his team during the week of practice. Hey, fellas, this is not a team because here's the danger. Clemson is so good, and this is how good, they're this and they're that, and we got to play the perfect game, and if we don't play the perfect game, we can't beat them. Number one, that's you're talking yourself down, number one. Number two, you're putting this really crazy expectations of perfection, and if you don't come out right away and you're hot and blazing, then you can't beat that team. I felt the 2020 team needed to kind of be that. They needed to kind of come out and sort of play close to the perfect game to beat Clemson. That's not the reality of these two teams now. And I think that's the point that he's got to get across to the players, Sean, is, hey, fellas, you don't have to be perfect. We don't have to play out of our minds to beat Clemson because Clemson's up here and we're down here. We're Notre Dame. We're on the same level with them. We're the same. We're every bit as good as they are. That's something, even if deep down you don't necessarily believe that, that's got to be the message. I actually do believe that, and we'll get into the matchups of this particular game during the week of our shows and explain why we see that. But it's one of those things where you say, hey, listen, it's the mentality of we just go play our game. And he talked later in the show, he made a comment like, look, it's just do your job every single play. You don't have to, Isaiah Foskey, you don't have to play out of your mind. Just do your job every play. Drew Pine, we don't need you to be Trevor Lawrence. Just do your job every play. And if you make a mistake, bounce back and get it on the next play. You have to have that mentality in this game because if you put this pressure of we have to play this perfect game to beat them, then you're going to be you're going to be so tight that you're just not going to be able to win this game. And the first time some adversity hits, you're just, bam, we're done. And that's been that real tight mentality we've seen from this team so many times in these type of matchups. And that's what has to be different. It's like, guys, you're Notre Dame. You don't have to worry about Clemson. You're Notre Dame. Do your job. Do your job. And I really like that message. It was important because, as you responded on Twitter to that comment, Sean, Marcus Freeman should not be allowing the conversation of, the David versus Goliath, this big, it's an upset simply from where the standings are and what the spread is because of we didn't handle our business going in between, coming in. But as he said in the thing, and early in the podcast is, but we are that team. So he keeps reiterating his football team. He said it after Syracuse. We are a darn good football team.
Yeah.
And he's not letting them feel sorry for themselves. We are a darn good football team. You've got to believe that, though. And that belief is how you go out and play. And that's how a team shows up on the road against a really good Syracuse team who just outplayed Clemson for a big chunk of that game at Clemson. How Notre Dame walked on that field and said, I don't care what you did against Clemson. We're Notre Dame, you're Syracuse. Yeah. And now we're going to show you for 60 minutes what that means.
Yeah.
And that's the mentality this team needs against Clemson.
And I'm sure IB Nation is going to have that shown to them throughout the week with all of the shows that we're going to do with the different matchups. When you start looking at the matchup of this game, you're going to recognize, as we've been saying, this is not the Trevor Lawrence, Deshaun Watson Clemson team. Good team.
Yes,
Good
very good team.
But not as deep, very talented. Front seven on defense, questionable positions on the offensive line, questionable quarterback play. It's like it's a lot of flaws that Dabo himself is trying to figure out coming to this matchup, which is probably beneficial that they will be coming off a bye week for them because they've had time to work on the things that they need to work on. But this is what I love about this matchup. And it takes me back to 2020. They look like the bully. They sound like the bully. But they got to prove to us that they're the bully. Because we're not running. We got these big boys eating. They ate against Syracuse. We're going to try and make them eat against you. We're not coming with tricks. We're coming straight ahead.
Right.
And we're going to run the ball. If you stop us, congratulations.
Yeah.
But you're not going to stop us from running. We're running the ball. That's what we're doing.
Right.
Have fun. Because I don't know how cold it's going to be.
Not very.
It's going to be a physical. Bring your lunch pail. Tell your mama to turn her face from the TV because it's going to get ugly. And the last time that Notre Dame faced this team, they dominated the physical aspect of the game 6 of the 8 quarters in 2020. And I don't think the offensive line is as good as this offensive line, in my opinion. I don't think they were coached as good as this offensive line is going to be coached against Clemson. Now, it's debatable whether or not this Clemson defense is better than that defensive front because most of these guys that are here now were babies in that game. Freshmen, sophomore, and now they're juniors and seniors. So that's debatable. But my point is the standard has been set. They can show them on film. We can push them around. We've done it. We've been able to be successful being physical against this defense and this defensive front. And as Marcus Freeman said today, my guys are ready. My guys are ready.
Right.
Like I have them right where I want them mentally. My guys are ready. Now we have to go execute. Right. That's it. Because we're ready as a team. And that is for him to feel like he has gotten his team to that point. And Stanford was literally just, it feels like yesterday, like the low of Stanford. And for him to feel like he has his team ready to go on the Monday before the game, he's telling you the Monday before the game, they're ready. We're ready.
Yeah.
That's an accomplishment. And that goes to not just Marcus Freeman and the coaches. The players deserve credit for that as well.
Yeah.
Because everyone had to come together.
Because they got to answer the bell.
Absolutely.
You can challenge them all you want.
Absolutely.
And you can do all the right things. And I mean, this is where the line between coaching and playing comes in. And on this particular show, and a lot of it's because of our backgrounds and the things that we believe in, is things that I believe in, that the guys that are on the show with me, we have similar philosophies on football, and that is, you can talk about the Jimmies and the Joes, but I could spend an entire hour talking about examples of teams that went from mediocre to really good with the same exact dudes. The only thing that changed was coaching or a mindset or whatever the case may be, right? Notre Dame does not win a championship in 1988 if Jerry Faust is still the head football coach, right? I mean, you can talk about the dudes all you want, right? And Jerry Faust recruited Tim Brown and a lot of the dudes that were on the 1988 national title team. Not some of the younger guys, but a lot of the older guys. I mean, a lot of the guys on defense were Jerry Faust recruits, at least in the front seven anyway. And so you look at it, Sean, and you say, it's got to come to the coaches have to set the plan. They have to set the mentality, the mindset. They have to create the culture, the environment for players to grow and develop and all that. But then there comes a point in time where I can take you only so far. Now it's time for you to go do it. And I think that's a big piece to this thing is, if you can create the right environment. And I think I think it's important for him to take that mindset too, Sean, because if you do, because you could go into this game. There's another approach that Coach Freeman could have taken, and hear me out on this.
Mm-hmm.
He could have gone into this game and been like, "Hey, we're this big underdog. Nobody believes in us. Nobody thinks we can play. We've got this giant juggernaut." And I think to a degree that's probably going to happen, but not from the disrespect nature of it, but you're trying to hype the opponent up so much in an attempt to try to take the pressure off of your team. Right. And I don't love that approach, but it's an understandable one. What I liked about it is because I think the approach that he's taking is, hey guys, you don't have to put all this pressure on yourselves to play above and beyond. You just have to be you. And that's the mindset, because I'm going to say this, and Saturday is going to be the same exact story. In 2020, when you took Trevor Lawrence out of that lineup, what we all realized is Notre Dame and Clemson are two very similar football teams.
Very similar programs.
Very similar teams. Both really good in the trenches. Both had really good defensive lines. Notre Dame had a little bit of a better offensive line. You know, Clemson had a great playmaker on the second and third level. Notre Dame had a great playmaker on the second and third level. You know, both had strengths at different places. Notre Dame had a great safety. You know, Clemson had maybe a better corner. Both had big-time playmakers, you know, at different positions. And you know, Notre Dame had Kyron Williams at running back. They had, they had Kyron Williams at Travis Etienne. I keep wanting to say the brother's name that's now playing for Florida. You know, you had talent at tight end. You had Michael Mayer as a freshman. You had Tommy Trumbull, who was a high draft pick. You had Javon McKinley, who made some big plays. And then you had an experienced quarterback in Ian Book against a young kid making his second career start. And on that particular day, Notre Dame's quarterback made more plays in crunch time. Now, also almost lost the game with that fumble, but then recovered from the fumble and went and led them down late on a big-time touchdown drive and made the plays that he needed to make. Then you fast forward a month later, and you're playing in the championship game, and now Trevor Lawrence was back, and all of a sudden they look like two completely different football teams.
Yeah.
And so that's still going to be an element to Saturday, right? I think the difference now, however, is, number one, Drew Pine has to play better. We'll get into that during the week. But number two is the margin for error outside of quarterback is much smaller for Notre Dame now than it was 2 years ago, because the other team doesn't have that star at quarterback that if you don't play the perfect game, you're not going to have a chance to win. Yeah. And that's the difference now between these two teams. And so, and in some areas you could say Notre Dame is better than Clemson is in some ways, at least when they're playing their game. And that ultimately is what it comes down to, Sean. Which version of Notre Dame is going to come up? Because before we go into the Coach Mason stuff, here's my final piece to this. There's been a lot of talk about Notre Dame doesn't play at home, play well at home this year. What do they got to do differently to play better at home? I don't know if we know if that's accurate or not. Is it because they don't play as well at home? Or is it because this team plays to the level of their competition or the perceived level? I've had people say, well, Notre Dame doesn't play to the level of their competition. North Carolina hasn't – somebody has said this. North Carolina hasn't beat anybody, and BYU hasn't won a game since. You're missing the point. It's the perception that the team has about the opponent they're about to play. Ohio State, number 2 team in the country. You're going to be ready for that one.
Right.
North Carolina, 3-0, scoring a mess of points, high-octane offense, averaging over 50 points a game, averaging almost 600 yards of offense. You know that you're locked into that game. It's on the road. BYU, number 16 team in the country. It's the Shamrock game. It's the glitz. It's the glamour. It's the new – you're mentally focused, locked into that game. And then Syracuse on the road. Was it because it was on the road or because you're playing the number 16 team in the country? At home, you've played Marshall. Who cares? Right? You've played Cal. Who cares? You played UNLV. Who cares? And you've played Stanford, who stinks, who you've blown out. There's not a kid on this roster that went into that game that, except for Josh Lugg, like the 6th year, and Avery Davis, the 6th-year seniors. There was not a single kid on this roster that has played in a game against Stanford that wasn't a blowout. Because every kid that was part of the 2018, 2019, 2020, and 21 classes have all played against Stanford in games where they blew them out. They blew them out 38-17 in 2018. They blew them, was it 45-24 in 2020?
Mm-hmm.
Correct, or 2020, 2019. They didn't play in 2020. It was 45-24, and then of course last year they beat them 45-14. So it's just kind of like you're overlooking them. You're like, Stanford's no good. So
Right.
is it a home issue or a quality of the competition issue, and the lack of maybe leadership, maturity, whatever the case may be of that team? And we're going to find out what the answer is on Saturday against Clemson, because now you have the two worlds colliding. And so I don't know if it's necessarily a home versus away thing as much as this is the first actual good team you're going to play at home. And what will their mentality be like? So I'm very curious to see how that's going to play out, Sean, and what that dynamic is like.
And just before we go to Brian Mason, because I saw people in the chat talking about, I'm not sure we can run on Clemson.
First and 10, Syracuse.
And where's up? I'm sorry about that.
ESPN always does that, man. It drives me.
I had some video to accompany what I was about to say, but no. If you go, Syracuse ran the ball for 4.4 clip.
Mm-hmm.
Florida State ran the ball for 4.4 clip. Now, the caveat is they both had quarterbacks that could do damage with their legs.
Right.
But even if you take away the quarterback's yardage, the running back still averaged right around 4 yards per carry.
Right.
If Notre Dame averages 4 yards per carry, it's going to be a good night, because they're running the ball 30-plus times.
Right.
Minimum. Probably close to 40. That's going to be a good night against this defense, and they have to take advantage of the opportunities in the pass game.
Right.
We know that. We absolutely know that. I fully expect Notre Dame special teams to put their mark on this game in some way, form, or fashion, whether it's kickoff coverage, punt coverage, punting by John Sott, punt return. Something's going to happen in special teams for them to make a mark on this game. So absolutely. That was the big thing that was confusing. With Syracuse being up to double digits, Sean Tucker had 5 carries. But guess what, Brian? He averaged 10 yards a carry.
Right.
So that's on Syracuse for not taking advantage of the opportunity they had. Notre Dame's not making that mistake.
Well, and the thing about Syracuse too is Clemson could scheme their defense to take Sean Tucker out because of how much read zone that they did.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw that, Notre Dame was able to attack them in a way where it's like they weren't worried about the quarterback pulling.
No.
Like they did a couple runs late, but they were shutting it down. Syracuse tried to go away from that because their quarterback was banged up, and Notre Dame shut it down.
Yeah.
And but that's not the only game, right? Because here's the thing, Sean. What we do, you and I have always talked about this, is you can't just look at one game and say, well, this is what happened on those 5 carries, and he averaged 10.8 yards per carry. See, running backs can go on it. It's not just that. The game before against Florida State, you talked about how Jordan Travis had a lot of yards. It was a legitimate runner. Jordan Travis ran for 64 yards that game. It's pretty impressive, right? Yeah. On 14 carries. Notre Dame doesn't have that. But Lawrence Tofili and Trey Benson combined for 137 yards on 18 carries in that game.
Yes, sir.
Right? And then you look at the rest of the teams they've played. They haven't really played a lot of really good running teams. And that's the other part of it is, they haven't really played, like North Carolina State is 100th in the country in rushing, right? Wake Forest doesn't have they're 83rd in the nation in rushing. So when you look at the rest of the teams that Clemson has played, Georgia Tech's not a very good rushing team. They rank 96th in the country in rushing. Furman's a 1AA team. Louisiana Tech ranks 111th in the nation in rushing. And then you look at Boston College. They're really bad at rushing the football as well. They rank 131st in rushing. How many teams are there in college football, Sean? 131.
131.
Right? So they've played 2 teams. They've played 2 teams that rank in the top 40 in rushing. Now, Syracuse doesn't rank in the top 40 anymore because of Notre Dame, but they were ranked that high coming into that game. And that's Syracuse, and it's Florida State. And then you look at what those 2 teams did to Clemson. Syracuse, like you said, only rushed for 124, but 4.4 carry. Their running back had 10 yards carry. But Florida State's the game I look to and say, Florida State went for 206 yards. And even if you take away the quarterback runs, their two backs combined, like I said, combined for 137 yards on 18 carries, Sean. That's a really impressive performance.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's averaging, I'm looking at now, 7.6 yards a carry. I just typed it in because I was trying to do math in my head and I couldn't figure it out. But you look at it and you say, man, this is one of those games you say, Florida State was able to run on them. Well, Florida State has a run-throw quarterback, but they don't have the line that Notre Dame has. They have a good line, but it's not the line that Notre Dame has. So, there's a lot of things you can look at and say, hey, look, we've got to go do this. The opportunities are there. Do they have to play better than they did against Syracuse? Yes, they do. Mm-hmm. And that's why I wrote the article that I wrote today about, Drew Pine and Tommy Rees and about, you got to switch things up to get that kid's mind right, because you've got to get him back to looking like the kid that you saw against North Carolina and BYU.
Yeah.
And if you can get him back to being that kid, he doesn't need to be a world beater to beat Clemson.
No.
You just got to play your game. And that's going to be the key.